Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 16th episode in our series of podcasts on the Indian history. In this episode, we'll talk about the Mughals. Joining me as speakers in this episode are Jayavardhan Singh, Dr. Omar Ali, and Gaurav Lille. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Manish.
Right, Jay, we'll start with you. When we talk of Mughals, what is the evidence that we have? What are the various biographical, autobiographical sources of the Mughal rulers that we refer to when we talk of the Mughals?
So when it comes to the Mughal history particularly, we find that we have abundant resources. Sources, for example, right from the starting, like in the period of Babar, you have his biography. Then interestingly, even Jahangir wrote his biography. So in terms of, direct sources, like we have two emperors who wrote their own biography. And then we find particularly during the reign of Akbar, we find that Akbar really, he compiled different sources, not only about his period, but also about his ancestors. So, most of the works related to the early period of the Mughal reign was compiled during the period of Akbar. And we are told that when Akbar died, he had some 24,000 books in his in the imperial library. So these were the works that were compiled by Akbar, although not all of the works survived. But if we compare it, the sources which we have to the, let's say, Delhi, even leave alone the ancient period, but even the period of Delhi Sultanate or the period of 12th to 15th, 16th century, we find that Mughal sources are quite different in nature, because this was also the period when the Europeans really started to come in this part of the world. So from the travelogues of the different European travelers, then we have during the reign of Akbar, the Portuguese, the Jesuit missionaries who came to the court of Akbar. So they wrote their own memoirs, and from that period onwards, we have a strong tradition of writing history. So, in particularly about the Mughal period, we do not have any, historians do not have the excuse that we do not have any sources. So sources are very abundant.
And where are the original copies or manuscripts, say, of Babarnama? Or are they in India, or are they now found in museums of Central Asia or European countries or American countries?
I think when it comes to, so there are different copies. I'm not sure whether the original Babarnama survives, because in particular during the period of Akbar, we find that the older works were later, they were made into different copies, and also the illustrations were also carried out. So in most cases, they are either in the museums of Western countries, and sometimes what we also see is that private collections. So, for example, in the case of Persian manuscripts, so most of the older houses around northern India, older Muslim noble houses, they have preserved the older collections, and in some of the small libraries, we find that there are Persian manuscripts that are still there. So it is not that there is a particular place where all the manuscripts are present, but from the different, the compilation of these manuscripts has already been done during the period of the British. So we do not have to worry about finding these manuscripts. Most of them are with us, but there are some manuscripts, for example, particularly that are found in UP and Bihar. So because of the terrible conditions which we store our manuscripts, so some of these manuscripts may not survive in the future. So that is also the case.
Right. And I think it's also, we should note that while the Mughals did not take up printing, one of the things they could have done and did not, but they did have a lot of scribes, and it was common for them to make many copies of each book, right? So for rich people and prominent people would have copies of all these big books. So the major books, at least, there's no question of them being lost or anything. There are more than enough copies around. I think the part that may be still a little bit unexplored or less explored is things like official documents and letters and reports from intelligence agencies. There are thousands of those, probably mostly eaten by white ants or whatever. But they are probably, I vaguely remember reading somewhere that many of them have not been translated. So as we say about the Sanskrit documents, the same thing applies to even the Persian documents. These everyday documents are not all translated or used. Indian historians still have a lot of work to do.
Right. And if one were to visit the National Museum or National Archives in Lahore, are these copies, are these manuscripts easily accessible? Have they kept a better record of these things in Pakistan?
No, not really. I don't think that as far as documents are concerned, I think they're more likely to be in British hands or in Indian hands. Pakistan doesn't have big collections, and the things they have are not very well preserved. But there are, if you go to the museum, I have not been to the National Museum in Karachi, but there is a Lahore Museum, which is probably one of the better museums in the country. And what you see there is mostly like they have a few illustrated folios and things, right, to show you how they were illustrated and so on. But it's not like there's a major collection of documents being displayed or used by researchers. I don't know of any such thing really.
Also, I will add that in the Indian case, particularly, the National Archives at Delhi are, they have their setup and it is quite good. But when it comes to the state archives, there the situation is quite terrible. So also it depends on on which state you are referring. I'm particularly referring to UP and Bihar because I know about these two states' archives.
Right. Right. So let's get started. The first emperor is Babar. What's his backstory, Jay? What do we know about Babar's early days and why did he end up in India?
Babar was born in 1483. He was the eldest son of a Timurid chief who's called Umair Sheikh Mirza. And his mother was a direct descendant from Genghis Khan. So his father's principality was in the Fergana Valley. And this was the time, when there is a constant struggle that is going on about the legacy of Temur particularly. So what we find, Babar was a, descendant of Temur. So after the death of his father at the age of 12, he ascends the principality of his father. And during this time, as I have said, that Central Asia as a region is contested by mainly three powers. So first we have these are three groups. First are Timurids. Then there are Mongols who are situated in the province of current day Xinjiang. And then there are Uzbeks who are a growing power. And what we find is that the Timurids from which Babar comes, they are not a cohesive group. They are fighting among themselves. Then they are fighting with the Mongols, and then they are also fighting with the Uzbeks. So eventually, what happens is that after from the age of 12, when he becomes the a ruler of this petty principality in Fergana, the next 10 years is the period when he is constantly fighting, and the main prize for Babar is Samarkand, the capital which was the capital of Temur. So in this from 12 to the next 10 years, there is this struggle, and he managed to control Samarkand for a brief period of time twice. And but eventually what we find is that the Uzbeks, particularly their leader Shaybani Khan, so he eventually forced Babar out of the Fergana Valley. So in 1504, with around we are told that around 300 lightly armed men, Babar reaches Kabul. So Kabul was the part of the Timurid Empire, so he had a claim on that. And just 2 years before his arrival, his uncle was ruling there. But after his uncle, there was this usurper who was not a very popular ruler in Kabul. So Babar managed to dethrone him and occupy Kabul. Now, from 1504 to the period, the next 20 years, Babar will remain in Kabul. And one of the main reasons why he eventually ended up in India was because in his memoirs, he writes that Kabul, he did not controlled the whole region of Afghanistan. The surrounding areas of Kabul was only controlled by him. And whenever he wanted to, have the revenue of the different regions of Afghanistan, in most of the time, the Pashtun tribes did not allow him to, simply send their money. He had to send soldiers in order to, get their revenue. So Babar was greatly, also this was also the period when he was also trying to, retake the Fergana Valley. So the next, from 1504 to the next 20 years, Afghanistan is the main base for Babar, and eventually Babar realizes that because of the power of those Beygs, he will not be able to control the Fergana Valley or the Samarkand. Although eventually, for a brief period of time, he did manage to have access to Samarkand, but the possibility of conquering it and displacing those Beygs was not there. And Afghanistan was also not the place to start to have a strong kingdom, because the revenue sources were not there. So eventually, because Babar claimed that the region of India was part of the Timurid's territory, so he had claim on this region. And during this time, we also see that the Lodhis, who were ruling the most of the northern India from Delhi, so Sikandar Lodhi had shifted his capital to Agra. And what we find is that during this period, there is this inner turmoil within the Lodhi Sultanate, and this inner turmoil greatly helped Babar, because the governors who were present in Punjab, the Lodhi governors, they collided with the central authority, and because of this, eventually around by the time of 1520, the region up to Chenab was part of Babar. And in the fifth expedition, in the late 1520s, 1525, he starts his fifth and final expedition to conquer the Lodhi Sultanate. And in April 1526, we have the first battle of Panipat, and he was able to win this battle. But the battle which eventually, led to establishing Babar's authority over large parts of northern India was the Battle of Khanwa. Khanwa is some 65 kilometers west of Agra. So the Battle of Khanwa was between the Rajput principalities, which was, under the leadership of Rana Sanga. Rana Sanga was the ruler of Mewar. So in this battle, Babar was greatly outnumbered, but he managed to defeat Rana Sanga, and with this defeat, Babar was able to establish his authority over most of the northern India.
Right. And I think it's worth noting also at this point that this is basically a war band, right? We sort of probably romanticize them more now, but the Mughals are entirely in this tradition of these steppe warriors who get together, and the big man has a comitatus, sort of a gang of people who are bound to him by oaths and loyalty. They're sort of his brothers. and this band of brothers is going to attack someone and plunder them, and then the leader will share the gifts with everybody. And the only rule is that the best man wins. So even in terms of succession, every single Mughal succession was disputed, right? They all killed their brothers or their sons or their uncles because it was a free-for-all. This is a warrior band conquering an empire, plundering it and distributing it to their friends. But then what made them one step higher than this is really Akbar's rule, which established a much deeper kind of administrative and institutional basis for this empire. But until Babar and Humayun's time, it's really just this, nothing else.
Right. So, Omar Saab, what have you read about how does Humayun make a comeback after Sher Shah Suri disposes of him?
Right. So, well, Babar won probably partly because of his technological superiority. He had Ottoman gunners giving him artillery, which India did not have at that time. And this superiority allowed Humayun to continue to defeat other principalities around him for a while. But he was probably not a very competent ruler. And his brothers gave him a lot of trouble, as is usual for the Mughals. So he lost the empire to Sher Shah Suri, who was just, an Afghan adventurer, self-made man, who actually started some of the institutional and administrative reforms that later Akbar built upon to really create the empire. But Sher Shah Suri, unfortunately for his dynasty, died very soon, just 5 years after he won the empire. And his son also didn't survive very long. So that Sur dynasty was falling apart already. And Humayun had, with the help of the Persians, he had taken refuge in Safavid Persia and had in fact formally converted to Shiaism there as a sort of the price for his hospitality because that was a very intensely Shia regime. And they gave him some money and some help, and he was able to finally come back to India. But I think it was more the Sur Empire itself falling apart and everybody fighting each other that already sort of made it possible for Humayun to come back and capture Delhi again. But he didn't recapture most of the empire, right? It was just a small portion, Punjab and Delhi mostly. And then he happened to fall down the stairs of his library and died. So Akbar at age 13 inherited the throne and luckily had a regent, Bairam Khan, who was able to hold things together. And there was a attempt at Hindu revival at that point, right? Himu, one of the generals of the Suris, decided to make a bid for emperorship himself, declared himself Vikramaditya, whatever, sacred emperor in Delhi, captured Delhi, and then had a very huge army that marched out to meet Akbar's army again at Panipat. But again, the Mughals, and maybe it was their technical superiority, or maybe it was just the fact that Himu got hit by an arrow and died in the middle of the battle, so his army sort of gave up hope. Otherwise, who knows what the history of India might have been like. But that's where the Mughal Empire really restarts, because then Akbar and Bairam Khan recaptured the throne, recaptured Agra, and sort of at least started the empire consolidating the empire in North India. And as they were doing this, as soon as Akbar got to be about 16, 17, he was able to take the reins from Bairam Khan. And there's some accounts at least that he had Bairam Khan assassinated by sending him off to Hajj and then having an assassin kill him on the way. But other people think he didn't do it. I don't know. Jay may know more about that. So Jay, if you can shed some light.
Jay, before you start on Akbar, I'd just like to know that I read somewhere that Sher Shah Suri is the one who put the foundation of the Grand Trunk Road, the road that sort of is synonymous with the subcontinent. How much do we know about that? And is that a fact that Sher Shah Suri is the one who started the construction of the original Grand Trunk Road?
No, I think that's a very popular myth. I think Umar Saab will know that Salman Rashid ji has a whole book about this, particularly the region of Grand Trunk Road, which covers Pakistan. So this was the old, route which was called Uttar Path. So by that, even before the modern times, so in the pre-modern period, we have this road that was, connecting the region of Gandhar to going all the way from the passing from northern India to the port of Tamralipti. So this was a long route that was already present, and Sher Shah Suri, maintained it. He built sarais over this route, and he was not the one who built the whole road. He just, rebranded it, I think is the way to put it.
He clearly had ambitions that went well beyond being just a warband leader. So he had administrative reforms. He set up the early tax system, which I think Akbar built on later. And then he probably did rebuild or repair the road. He got some credit for it because he must have done some work on it. He built huge forts at the end of it. And it's likely that he was involved in some rebuilding or improvement of the road at least. The road itself, the old road across North India, this is the obvious route and has existed probably for hundreds of years before that, as Jay said. But that he improved it or made more facilities on it or put milestones on it where they were not there before. Something like that probably did happen. But Jay, is that correct?
Yes, and I think about most of the reforms. So, for example, the revenue reforms and the currency, which Sher Shah Suri, like the silver currency, rupya, which was later adopted by the Mughals. And interestingly, Todarmal was one of the ministers who were involved in this revenue reform of Sher Shah, which Akbar later, Todarmal also became part of Akbar's court. So in that way, most of the reforms and the Akbar was wise enough to adopt these reforms, I think.
Right. So they built on Sher Shah Suri's reform. So Sher Shah Suri, even in his short reign, 5 years, did manage some achievements and would still count as one of the more successful or more innovative rulers of India. And his being a self-made man, sort of an Afghan adventurer who got to rise this high, all of this makes him sort of a heroic figure, I think, and a lot of legends have grown around that. But of course, the big founder of the Mughal Empire is really Akbar. And so I think we should have Jay tell us something about Akbar now.
One interjection. Omar mentioned about how there is a tale of a stray arrow killing Hemu during the battle. So Jay, I have come across this, I wouldn't say use the word trope, but this tale in a lot of battles describing Indian armies, either within themselves or against the outsider invader, so to speak. So is this a common pattern, like from Panipat 1 to Panipat 3, because that is the story? So maybe you can add some light on that.
Like about why Panipat became an important.
No. As in the tendency to fall after the ruler dies. That sort of
and
thing.
of the ruler sort of being hit by an
unlucky arrow, and then the army sort of disbands and is unable to carry on even if they have numerical strength. So that is a trope I come across again and again, reading about, especially insider outsider fights or those kind of things. So is there some pattern to it, or just
Yes, I think even the Europeans who were there, in particularly after the Mughals had lost their power, so they also like I remember reading Travernier's account. So Travernier was this French traveler who came to the court of Aurangzeb. So he describes how, while this war of succession during the reign of Shah Jahan when his sons fought with each other. So he also describes this particular peculiarity of the Indian armies. So he's not talking about the Hindu or the Muslim armies. He is talking about the whole Indian army, in various Indian armies. So he describes how, they have this great numbers, but when it comes to whenever one of the main leaders dies, the whole army such just melt away. So this was, I think, maybe it has to do with the fact that most of these armies were not professional in that sense. And I think particularly about Hemu. So most of the sources which we have are Mughal sources. So we do not have Hemu's account. And but it is also true that when the battle was over, Bairam Khan, presented a sword to Babar to cut off the head of Hemu, and Akbar eventually did this act, and the title of Ghazi was later, because then he was able to adopt this title of Ghazi. So Akbar, Hemu did die, and maybe because of this arrow, although I would say that, an arrow hitting your eye would instantly kill you, most likely, but the fact that he survived just to be beheaded by Akbar is also an interesting way to look at it.
Right. Moving on to Akbar, we know he set up the foundation of the Mughal Empire and some of the administrative reforms that he brought in. But one of the things that's always intrigued me is this idea that he came up with of Deen-e-Ilahi. What do we know about that, Jay? And how is it that it did not spread out more across the empire, and with all the backing that Akbar gave it? What happened to that whole idea of, a different kind of religion, or whatever we may call it?
I think the religious policy of Akbar, it evolved, and if you think cynically, you will find that there's this pattern when, in 1563, Akbar, does away with the pilgrimage tax. And in 1564, the famous jizya was also, revoked. And so this would seem that Akbar was, trying to be more accommodating to the Hindus. But in 1568, with the conquest of Chittor, he issues the famous Fatnama, or the victory declaration as it is called. So here he boasts about engaging the jihad and establishing Islam in this region. And around the end of 1579, he also issues this famous Mazhar, in which he tells that he is the final authority when it comes to Islam. But this act does not gain any ground with the Muslim clerics. And around the time of 1580s onwards, we see this process, particularly in the case of Akbar's religious affiliation, when he establishes the famous Ibadat Khana, in which he debates, or he converses with the clerics of different religions. And this policy in Akbarnama, we have this name Sulh-e-Kul. Sulh-e-Kul is translated as peace with all, universal translation, and all that. So Deen-e-Ilahi is this new philosophy of Akbar, which is trying to take whatever good in the eyes of Akbar from different religious sources, and built a philosophy around it. Now, whether it was a new religion or just a attempt of Akbar to form a what we can say, a type of philosophy in which the different elite groups of Akbar's court would unite. So there is a whole debate on how historians have viewed this. So more in the time of Akbar, you have Badauni, who is against most of the reforms of Akbar. So he thinks that Akbar is he's doing away with Islam. And but when we read the account of Abul Fazal, so Abul Fazal was writing on behalf of Akbar. So in that we do not see this as a new religion, but it is more of like I think compare it how Ashok has used this philosophy of Dhamma to consolidate his empire. That's one way to look at it. I think the policy of Sulh-e-Kul or this is also an attempt by Akbar to incorporate the different religious philosophies into a singular whole. So I think that makes sense, if that makes sense.
And I think in the case of Akbar, I think we should accept that there is such a thing as people learning and growing and changing their views also. Akbar's early years are very typical Mughal years, right? He's killing his enemies, making conquests, making deals, and his own courtier is writing in his biography that he was full of the spirit of jihad and he was Ghazi and this and that. None of that is actually should be controversial or disputed. This was very much a part of his early reign, and his attacks on the Rajput strongholds and the massacres, in one case at least building pyramids of skulls, all of that happened. So there's no doubt about the fact that at that point at least Akbar, whatever his personal beliefs, was behaving like any other Ghazi sort of emperor of Hindustan. But over time, he did have a genuine curiosity about religion. And he clearly, he had the Ibadat Khana, he had people come there and debate with each other, and he would ask them questions. And if you read the accounts of different people about this Ibadat Khana, it's quite clear that the emperor was quite sophisticated philosophically and would ask very serious philosophical questions. So it wasn't just a show that he was making for the sake of, uniting his empire or something. That was probably part of it. But he did have some change in his own beliefs also. And at some point, I think we can say that he really did apostatize, that his last years, you can consider him non-Muslim because he started a kind of a new religion for himself. I don't think it's a new religion in the same way that Islam is a religion or Christianity is a religion. It was probably never meant to be a mass religion. But within the court, it was meant more like the court of Akbar will have Akbar as the central sort of sun around whom everybody orbits. And he has sort of godlike characteristics in this religion. And everybody, even their greeting is Allahu Akbar, in this case, meaning that Allah is Akbar or Akbar is Allah. Right, so the emperor they literally prostrated, did sajdas in front of the emperor. So his closest courtiers did convert, but not all of them. There's some, according to Wikipedia, 19 people total converted to Deen-e-Ilahi in its entire existence. So it's not exactly a popular religion, but it's the religious philosophy that the emperor considers his own personal belief. And his favorite courtiers, or those who want to be his favorite courtiers, are invited to join him in this philosophy, which puts him at the center of the world and makes them all, and sort of welcomes various religions into it, and is a synthesis that the emperor has thought up of different religions, right? It has fire worship from Zoroastrianism, it has Sufi elements from Ibn al-Arabi in Spain, it has a lot of Hindu elements in it as well, and he sort of mixes them all up. This is his personal belief system. Maybe it shouldn't be called a religion in the full sense of the word, but it was his personal beliefs probably did shift. He was not a practicing Muslim by any stretch of the imagination after 1582, but it did not become a mass religion.
Also, I think I would like to add that the fact that Akbar is having these conversation, and also we are told that he did not learn to read and write. So this also is like I have read accounts that people claim that he was probably a dyslexic. So maybe we do not know. But interestingly, what we find that eventually Akbar got tired of the Ibadat Khana debates. So he records that in most cases, the different priests would try to, just claim the superior, convert him, and also claim that their way, that their religion is more superior to, and also about Umar Saab's view that, at the end of his reign, he probably was not a Muslim. So there is this indirect reference, which some historians have tried to argue, that by the time of 1601, so Akbar dies around 1605, so just 4 years before his death, there was this attempt, although there was no formal proclamation, but Akbar really wanted to, ban the formal Islamic rites like praying in public. And so these types of rites Akbar wanted to ban, but because of the fact that, if this order was carried out, this would have a serious destabilizing role in the Mughal Empire. So he did not eventually order this. But there is this view that Akbar at some point wanted to have this measure carried out. And also about this Akbar's courtier accepting this philosophy of Deen-e-Ilahi. Famously, we are told that Man Singh refused. So Man Singh was very close to Akbar, but he refused. So it is also interesting, I think.
Right. I think that's interesting that the only Hindu who converted to Deen-e-Ilahi was Birbal. But the fact that Akbar had, Birbal and Man Singh and Todarmal as senior ministers in his, or very powerful ministers in his government, is also an indication that clearly he's not a typical Muslim ruler in that sense. Even though even Aurangzeb continued to employ a lot of Hindu generals. In fact, I think Audrey Trushka has counted the number and claimed that he employed more than Akbar, which is probably true. The empire had matured by that time, so there were just many more officers in it. So I'm sure there were more Hindu officers employed as well. But the attitude that Akbar had was much more accommodating than any later emperor did or any prior emperor did. He was different in these ways. I think that's something that he should be given some credit for.
Just one question, interjection for maybe Omar to add upon. So when we talk about how Akbar started this tradition, Deen-e-Ilahi, and how successful it was. So we have in this history series tried to encapsulate the relationship of the ruler with the faith systems and how rulers have actively shaped. So what does this tell about the faith system itself? That arguably one of the most powerful ruler was also not able to bring about his own faith system. So how resistance is the internal system that even Akbar was unable to change. And also by the time any religious system matures, how difficult is it for rulers to sort of modify it? So we saw with this case, coming to recent history, we see how Kemal Ataturk also tried some reform, and now we see where we are back again. So maybe some discussion on that.
I agree. I think that first of all, it's very clear that it never became a mass religion, whether it was intended or not. I think it was probably not even intended. But even a lot of his courtiers, right? So Man Singh is saying he doesn't want to give up his Hinduism for the sake of Deen-e-Ilahi, and of course all the other Muslim generals and courtiers are not giving up Islam. So I think both religions were very well established by that time. They had strong orthodox institutions, and Akbar really had very little chance of sort of creating a new religion and carrying it off. So it's not surprising that he failed, I think, in that way. I think by that point, you could be an Islamic emperor who was trying to become more, Islamize this empire more, or you could be a Hindu emperor who is trying to make the empire, bring it back towards kind of Hindu roots. But there is very little chance of somebody starting a new religion and then having everybody agree to it. People already had strong beliefs and orthodox systems in place. I think any change would have been very gradual and very unlikely.
I think also I would like to add that most of these, these acts of Akbar happened when the authority of Akbar was very secure. And if we contrast this to his one of his descendants, so the fact that Dara was much more closer to Akbar, but one we can say his he erred because he started having these philosophical ideas or openly talking about these ideas when he was still a prince. So
Right.
Akbar was wise enough to have his authority first established, and then he was able to talk about more openly about his religious affiliations.
Right. And I think it's also, since that was part of probably Gaurav's question, the relationship with the ruled. First of all, the empire's attitude towards the general or common public of Hindustan was that they are their subjects and they are conquered subjects. And beyond that, they had very little interest in those people other than as taxpayers, right? As long as they paid their tax, that's it. If they don't pay their tax, they will be slowly tortured and killed. But other than that, there were very little interest. But clearly, the elite culture was a Persianate Islamic culture, right? Of the culture of the courts and the culture of the rulers themselves. And even if they employed Hindus or had Hindus in the administration, they were always in a subordinate role, and there was no question about who is sort of on top. So if you take that and extend the line and say, okay, let's suppose the Mughal Empire lasts until the 21st century, then one thing would be undisputed. It would be a Muslim ruler ruling over Hindustan. It would not be the Mughal Empire, even under Akbar, but especially after Akbar. There's no way it was going to be anything other than a Muslim empire, right? And that empire and its cultural products are really first and foremost Islamic in origin, not Hindu in origin. Whether they were influenced by Hindus in some form or the other, and some things they adopted from the local people for sure, but who was on top was always sort of clear.
Right, we've got Shrikant who's also joined us. Hi, Shrikant.
Hey Manish, hey everyone.
Shrikant, you wanted to ask a question to Jay and Omar?
Yeah, I had a question. To what extent was Akbar's Deen-e-Ilahi and patronage of Hindus, was it born out of his own intellectual convictions as opposed to an attempt maybe to build some kind of a counterweight in the court to the growing influence of Persian nobles? So was it politically motivated to some extent that he wanted to build a Hindu elite in his court to counter the Persian nobles in the court whom he probably didn't like? Is there, I'm not well read on this, so wondering if there is that angle to this as well.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll let Jay come in and give us the more authoritative view on this. But I think I already sort of gave a small speech about this, that I think in Akbar's case, there was some genuine philosophical growth or development of his own also. He did genuinely feel like he became a vegetarian, right? There's no point really in becoming a vegetarian for him. I don't think that meant one way or the other too much to his subjects. They wouldn't even know that the emperor had become vegetarian. But there was probably some genuine belief involved here. And once he had gone towards the Deen-e-Ilahi route, probably did have some genuine philosophical beliefs in that direction also. But that it also suited his institutional or sort of administrative needs, that's very much possible. It's possible he was promoting some people to balance other people. Was he promoting Hindus to balance the Persians? Maybe, although I haven't read that, maybe Jai will tell us more. But I think the amount of influence that the Hindus exerted in the court was still not going to be at the level of the Turkish nobles or the Mughal nobles themselves. By the way, we started this whole discussion of the Mughal Empire and didn't comment on the fact that they themselves did not call it the Mughal Empire, right? They called their family Temuri or Gurkhani, which is in-laws of the Genghis Khan of the Mongols. So this word really came into use in the 19th century and is more of a European word for that empire. The country they ruled, they called it Hindustan. and the family that ruled, they called their family either Gurkhani or Temuri, Khandani Temuria. Right, Jay?
Right, Jay?
Yes, Chagatai also.
Chagatai also. Right. They were Chagatai Turks, right.
So, Jay, to Shrikant's specific question, was this a counterweight to the emerging Persian influence?
I think we can separate these two. So, patronage of Hindus was more or less a politically motivated act, but the philosophy of whole Deen-e-Ilahi Sulh-e-Kul was his own, his own philosophical, exploration, because most of these acts, particularly about Hindus, so by around 1563, he does away with the pilgrimage tax, and in one after this, in the next year, he does away with jizya. So these happened before there was this talk about Deen-e-Ilahi or Sulh-e-Kul, and also I think particularly this incorporations of Rajputs in Akbar's court was in some way, I think, was an attempt to counterweight the Turani and the Irani influence, and also because this was in 1570s, the Uzbeks who had settled in northern India, they were giving great trouble to Akbar. And so in order to counterbalance these different forces, the incorporations of Rajputans also in Indian Muslims. So these two were, in a sense, we can say that, in order to counterbalance these opposite powers. So Akbar's incorporation of Rajput was also a politically motivated act, and we also see that because the kind of terms which he granted to the Rajputs who Rajput houses who submitted was also quite extraordinary. So for example, in most cases, most of the Mughal nobles, they had their Jangirs, and these Jangirs were rotated. So there was no fixed Jangir, and the reason was quite obvious, because Akbar did not want to have a permanently settled nobility or Akbar who can challenge the Mughal emperor. So that is why these Jangirs were continuously rotated. But in the case of Rajputs, they had this Watan Jangir. So Watan Jangir was the Jangir which was the principality of the Rajputs, particular Rajput leader. So Amber was, for example, Amber was the Watan Jangirs of the Kachwaha ruler who was in the service of the Mughal emperor, and this Watan Jangir would remain in the hands of Kachwaha ruler. This would not, get transferred to, let's say, another noble of the Mughal Empire. So in that sense, this was also an act to counterbalance and also incorporate the different powers of northern India.
Right. Moving on from Akbar, Jahangir is when the empire is stable, there aren't too many internal conflicts. But how does Jahangir see himself and the empire in the context of East Asia or China or European influences? What is his worldview? Where does he see the Mughal Empire in the larger scheme of things that's happening around India?
I think with Jahangir, one thing is that he was addicted to opium and an alcoholic, so not one of the most hardworking of emperors. He was known to disappear for days on end on drunken binges. But the empire had been established on such sort of solid foundation that even this kind of emperor could, and he had, he would wake up and act also. He even had conquests. He enlarged the empire further and so on. And he pulled back from, the Deen-e-Ilahi sort of died with Akbar, although Dara Shikoh tried a revival, which didn't work. But the court became more sort of a little bit more orthodox Muslim also under Jahangir. And Jahangir was, as far as his view of the world and his worldview, I think by that time they had already established with Abul Fazal and all these Faizi and everybody, writing their praises. Abul Fazal's Ain-e-Akbari, I once started to read the thing, and the first 5 pages are like just the titles of Akbar, the grand emperor, the sun, the moon, the stars, and it goes on for literally 5 or more pages. So they had established this kind of worship of the emperor and a very Persian kind of conception of kingship that was so solidly established by Jahangir's time that his occasional incapacity did not sort of harm him too much. But at one point in his reign, it was said that his queen was ruling, and in fact was the only queen in the Mughal dynasty who issued coins in her own name also, right? There are coins issued in the name of Nur Jahan, who was just the wife of Jahangir. Nobody else in the Mughal dynasty ever did anything like that. So she clearly had a lot of influence at court and was for a time maybe the de facto ruler while her husband was mostly drunk or stoned. But he did, the one thing that happened in his reign that would have repercussions later was the clash with the Sikhs started. Right, Guru Arjun was killed on his instructions in Lahore. There is all this back and forth about whether this was a political thing, that Guru Arjun had supported Jahangir's own son's rebellion against him, or that it was a tax issue. But really, whatever way it was framed by Jahangir himself as a religious thing, although he called Guru Arjun a Hindu, not a Sikh. To him, this was a sort of a Hindu usurper who was creating trouble for our empire in Punjab. The words are something like that. And so we had to sort of take action against him. And then but that started a kind of a conflict between Sikhs and the Mughals that quieted down for a while, but then of course reignited under Aurangzeb when he killed the 9th Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur. And the other interesting thing about Jahangir's reign, he had this long-running conflict with Malik Amber, African adventurer who had sort of become a minor ruler in the Deccan. Jay may know more about this. Jay, if you can shed some light on Jahangir in general and his confrontation with Malik Amber.
I think about his alcohol addiction, there is this, so famously Jahangir wrote his own memoir. And in this, there is this, I think I will quote a passage about his drinking problem. So he started drinking at the age of 14 and then he describes, so I quote, "From that time I took to wine drinking and from day to day took more and more until wine of the grapes had no effect upon me and I resorted to spirit drinking. In the course of 9 years, I got up to 20 cups of double distilled spirit, 14 of which I drank in the day and the remaining 6 at night. The weight of this was 6 years of Hindustan. My food in those days was 1 fowl and some bread. No one dared to expostulate with me, and matters reached such an extreme that when in liquor I could not hold my cup for shaking and trembling, I drank, but others held the cup for me." So this was his...
Yeah, his addictions were quite extreme. And although he claimed later that he started, he cut down on his wine drinking because he had become so sick from it. His hands shook and whatever. So he cut it down. But he would also take opium. He would also take majun, which is just sort of refined cannabis. So an all-round stoner and drunkard, but successful ruler nonetheless, who managed to keep the Mughal Empire going until he died. And then, of course, his sons fought it out and killed each other, and Shah Jahan became emperor.
No, but coming back to the question you asked about Malik Amber, Jay, what was that all about?
So, when we think of the Mughal Empire, we think of the fact that, Mughal Empire stretches from northern India to whole Deccan is is conquered and up to extreme south. So this was not the case. So the first expeditions in south of the Vindhyas was really happened in the period of Akbar. So Akbar managed to conquer just a brief overview of the situation in Deccan. So Bahmani Sultanate had already disappeared, and there were 4 successors of the Bahmani rulers. 4 or 5. I'm not sure 4 or 5. I have forgotten. So in the period of Akbar, the Ahmad Shahi dynasty was conquered, and Burhanpur was the region, particularly the region of Khandesh, came under the rule of Akbar. And Akbar was not able to, continue this policy of conquest. And this policy of conquest continued during the period of Jahangir. So Jahangir, so there is this Ahmad Shahi Sultanate that was there, and and there I think this Abyssinian slave Malik Amber, so he greatly, this concept of, like, there is some claim that this concept of guerrilla warfare, Bargigiri, which is the term which is used in Marathi, I think. So this concept of guerrilla warfare was greatly perfected by Malik Amber, and he was the one who used it against the Mughals when they tried to conquer this region. Because what we see in the period of Jahangir, that Burhanpur was already under the rule of the Mughals, and in 1616, I think, Jahangir, in order to carry out this campaign, he shifts his base from Agra to Burhanpur. And there is this whole struggle with the Deccan Sultanates really starts. So the conquest of Deccan was a really important actions of Mughal, which later this will continue during the reign of Shah Jahan. So Shah Jahan, the Aurangzeb, his third son was employed in Deccan to carry out this conquest, and eventually Aurangzeb would spend like around 28 years, I think, in Deccan for this conquest. So this was a adventure that was started from the time of Akbar and continued up to the period of Aurangzeb.
So can you tell us about, I heard an anecdote of Jahangir being frustrated with not being able to defeat Malik Amber. He sort of viewed Malik Amber as his greatest arch enemy of sort. And he had a painting of Malik Amber commissioned, and he used to fire bows at it. Like, is it true, or is it a made up sort of tale?
I don't know about it.
There is an existing painting which we should put on this post as well. You can easily find it, Jahangir and Malik Amber, if you Google, where Jahangir is standing on a globe and shooting arrows at Malik Amber, who he has presumably arrested. Of course, he never actually arrested him. He failed every time. But he did have a painting made where he is shooting at him.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah.
Right. But Jay, did Jahangir ever send emissaries to China or Far East or anywhere other than Central Asia? Did he ever explore those ideas? We know Thomas Roe visited him. Was there ever any curiosity? Were expeditions or emissaries sent?
I'm not sure about China, but the Safavid Persian Empire was, they shared the borders. And in his letters, Jahangir calls the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas his brother. And we are told that, in the late, around the end of his reign, the Ottomans managed to capture Baghdad, I think. And then, so there are four powers that are, controlling Central Asia and India during this time. So we have the Ottomans, who were Sunnis, and then in Central Asia, there were the Uzbeks, who were also Sunni, and the Mughal emperors, who were also Sunni, and the Safavids were only Shia. So there is this attempt by the Ottoman ruler, who we are told that who sent a letter to the Mughal emperor to have this triple alliance of sorts against Safavids, because the Mughals during this time controlled the city of Kandahar. Kandahar was an important city for the Persians, and we will see that during the period of Shah Jahan, this would the Safavids would be able to conquer this region, this city particularly. So in that sense, there is this diplomacy that is going on. And also we should say that the Portuguese, who now controlled Goa, they also have this somewhat of a bad relations with the Mughals, because what we find is that Thomas Roe, as you have mentioned, so he was there in the court of Jahangir from 1615 to 1619, and he wanted to have a trade agreement between the two kingdoms, but this did not happen. Although Jahangir did allow the English to set up their factory in Surat, and we are told that because of this, to oppose this act, the Portuguese, they ransacked a royal flotilla that was stationed in Surat. So this was an act that was committed by the Portuguese during this time.
Right. Moving on to his son Shah Jahan, and anybody who's ever visited India or plans to visit India ends up at a monument that he built. But what do we know about his early days, Jay? And what was his rule like?
Shah Jahan famously, the act which his son would commit, he has also committed. So he killed his elder brother Khusro. Although Khusro, the interesting aspect about Khusro is that there was this, talk within the Mughal household during the time of Akbar, that Akbar had this somewhat of a, Akbar, because of the drinking problem of Jahangir, there is this view that Akbar wanted to have his grandson, who is Khusro, the eldest son of Jahangir, to succeed. But this did not happen, and when Jahangir became the next Mughal ruler, Khusro, revolted, and Jahangir was able to defeat Khusro, and he partially blinded Khusro. And we are told that Khurram, who later became Shah Jahan. So he also revolted, and when he ascended the throne, he first killed Khusro and also his younger brother Shahryar. And in order to completely done away with any possibility that the sons of Khusro might challenge his authority, so the two sons of Khusro were also killed by Shah Jahan. So this was the starting of his reign. And so now I think I will also mention that in this way, Mughals, if we compare them to the Safavids or the Ottomans, practiced what we can call a open-ended succession. So in the famous case of Ottomans, we have their princes that are confined to harem. But this was not the case with the Mughals. The Mughals had their Mughal emperors gave their princes different Jangirs to rule. But this was, they ruled Jangir as other nobles would do. So it was not a semi-independent governorship. And I think I will like to, talk about an event that talks about Shah Jahan also, and also about his sons. So around 1644, we are told that, one of the eldest daughters of Shah Jahan, whose name was Jahanara. So Jahanara suffered severe burn because her dress caught fire in Agra. So in order to, she was greatly burned, and she was about to die, we are told. And to see her, her brothers arrived from different regions. So we have Aurangzeb, who is now in Deccan, undertaking the process of conquering Deccan. So he arrives, and then we have Suja. Suja was the second after Dara. Dara we have Suja. Suja, then Aurangzeb, and the eldest son of Shah Jahan was Murad. So Murad was controlling Bengal. Suja was controlling Bengal, and Murad was in Gujarat. So all of these brothers, they go to Agra. And interestingly, Dara Shikoh was not, governor during this time. He was in the center in Agra, and there was this general view among the Mughal court that he will succeed Shah Jahan. So we are told that, the Dara had built a mansion in Agra. So he went along with his brothers and the emperor to show off this mansion. And there was this underground room in this mansion. So when he led his brothers and the emperor to see this underground room, we are told that Aurangzeb did not went inside this room. He just sat on the entrance. And when the emperor asked why he is doing this, so he did not answer this, and we are told that he did not take the permission of the emperor, and he just left. So in order to punish him, Shah Jahan forbade Aurangzeb to visit the court for 7 months, and eventually Jahanara, who was about to die, but she did not die. So he had this reconciliation between her brother and her father. So when Shah Jahan told about why Shah Jahan asked Aurangzeb why you did not enter this room and why you were sitting at the door. So he told his father that he feared that Dara might confine the emperor and the 3 brothers into this room. So in order to avoid this, he was sitting on the door of this room, and that is why he left. So Shah Jahan was quite impressed because of this act, and we are told that he gave his quite favors to Aurangzeb after listening to this reason. So this, I think, also shows the kind of view which Shah Jahan also had about the succession that will happen after his death.
That's a lot of time.
Was Shah Jahan the first Mughal emperor whose mother tongue was Hindustani, Khadi Boli? I think he was probably the first person, right?
Right. He said he was definitely not. He didn't know Turkish. He knew only like a few. This written somewhere that he only knew a few words of Turkish. So by that time, Babar is writing his autobiography in Turkish. By the time of Jahangir, they are writing in Persian. And by the time of Shah Jahan, they don't even know Turkish anymore. But Persian has become their court language and their official language. And under the great Mughals, the ones who were successful, it remained Persian. Urdu as a term was not invented until the 1780s, right? But that language probably had already started evolving at that time in the court of Shah Jahan.
Got it. I mean, their mother tongue might have been Hindustani because I think Jahangir's mother was a Rajput, and even Shah Jahan's mother was a Rajput.
Shah Jahan's mother was also Rajput. Yeah, this is one of the the secular historians like to say that 3 out of 4 grandparents of Shah Jahan were Indian.
Also, during the time of Shah Jahan, so we also see that the process of dismantling or destroying temples had already started. So this famous conquest of Kangra, I think in this conquest Aurangzeb was involved. So after conquering the Kangra fort, the temple was destroyed and a bull was slaughtered on the site and a mosque was built over it. So this all happened during the reign of Shah Jahan. And earlier during the reign of Jahangir, so in the reign of Akbar, we had so Akbar allowed the construction of temples. But during the reign of Jahangir, the construction of temples was stopped, but the temples could be repaired. And by the time of Shah Jahan, this act of repairing the temple was also stopped by the Mughal authorities.
And we should add here that this is not some sort of, something they thought of on their own. There is a well-developed kind of Islamic jurisprudence around this topic, that the non-Muslims are allowed to live in a Muslim state, right? Or at least the ones who have a book, the people of the book, are allowed to stay alive. But they have to pay a special tax, and they always have to have various ways in which it's made clear that the rulers are Muslim and these people are inferior or subordinate to them. That part was gradually sort of, Akbar obviously in his later half was not following this at all. Jahangir allowed temples to be repaired. So even the repair, like you can repair a church in a Muslim country, but you can't build a new church. This is the Sharia position, right? But they never went exactly that far, but they did try some of those impositions started to creep back in. And Shah Jahan definitely was more Islamized than Jangir, who was definitely more than Akbar. So this was a gradual process of sort of re-Islamization of the empire after Akbar's apostasy. But by Shah Jahan's time, definitely the ulama and the Islamic orthodoxy had made a comeback and was the dominant faction in the court.
So I had just one question here. Maybe we didn't discuss about the religious outlook of the earlier two rulers, Babar and Humayun. So maybe just a brief account of that.
I think Babar's religious outlook was, he called himself Ghazi once when he needed to, and he believed in the same sort of Islamic supremacist ideology that the earlier Delhi Sultanate had operated under. So I don't think there was any new innovation or anything with Babar. He was pretty much comparable to the previous Muslim rulers of India. Humayun also was, I don't remember anything different about him. He was still, it could be any Delhi Sultanate ruler would be comparable to those two in terms of religious policy. The new innovations were mostly Akbar's.
I had a related question. I think we all know that the state religion was Sunni Islam during the great Mughals. But what was the status of Shias in the Mughal court? I understand there was a strong Sunni element that kind of reacted against Akbar's cosmopolitan policies. We had someone like Ahmad Sirhindi, who was also notoriously anti-Shia. So I was wondering if Shias lacked patronage in the court. Did they have a presence in the court, and also did they flourish in secular roles in bureaucracy and the army, or were they discriminated against?
So it seems to have varied. They did have a presence in the court, especially after Humayun came back from Iran. Obviously, he brought back a lot of Persians with him, who were all presumably Shia from the Safavid emperor. The artists and administrators that sort of were a gift to him or came with him. So there were Persian aristocrats in the Mughal Empire who were Shia. But they were always a much smaller faction than the Sunni faction. And there were periods of persecution of some Shias also in the Mughal rule, especially I think under Aurangzeb, which would not be surprising. There was, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. Once prominent Shia alim was tortured and killed by Aurangzeb. And that was, oh no, not by Aurangzeb, I'm sorry, I'm looking it up right now. Even in the time of Jahangir, there was one prominent Shia alim was tortured and killed. The Shia sort of remember him as one of the crimes of the Mughals.
And also, I think Bairam Khan, the famous general of Akbar, was a Shia.
Okay, got it.
And I think I remember reading somewhere that it was probably Aurangzeb who had said that it is only in the Sultanate of the Mughals we see that a Shia alongside a Sunni praying in the same mosque. So this unique aspect of the Mughals, where there is some agreement, accommodation between the Shia and the Sunnis is there.
Yeah, no, there was, for the most part, there was accommodation, but there were particular Shia ulama who were arrested or tortured also and killed. And so there is some episodes of Shia persecution, or at least persecution of particular Shia scholars did happen. But mostly the aristocracy at court did include Shias, and right until the end, even in times of Aurangzeb.
Also, the Mughals used this anti-Shia rhetoric when they, were to conquer this against they were, the military campaigns against the Delhi, the Deccan Sultanates. So these Deccan Sultanates were Shia.
Right.
So they used this anti-Shia rhetoric during this time also.
And maybe when they tried to take Kandahar from the Safavids, I think that was Shah Jahan's time.
Yes.
And that too, they may have done some propaganda like that. At that time, it may have been a little bit unsafe to be a Persian aristocrat in the Mughal court. But such things are mostly politics; they come and go.
Also,
And
I think. Yes, Gaurav. Yes.
Jay, go ahead. You were saying.
I think this also, has to do with the internal Mughal politics also, because you have the Turani faction who were Persianates but of Sunni origin. So in order to, counterbalance these Turani elements, you have to have the Irani elements also. So in that sense, there is this whole internal politics that is also going on. So I think that is also there.
Right. And it's also during Shah Jahan that the seat of the power moves from Agra to Delhi, right? That's when the Red Fort is built and Delhi as a city comes.
So he built Shah Jahanabad and made that the capital. The Mughals seem to have had a sort of a laissez-faire attitude towards the capital. They made Agra the capital. They made Fatehpur Sikri the capital. They made Shah Jahanabad the capital. They even made Lahore the temporary capital when Akbar was there for several years. And Aurangabad under Aurangzeb was the temporary capital. Or wherever the emperor happened to be for years on end, he was traveling in this huge, big camp, and this camp was really the moving capital of the Mughal Empire. So a capital city that remained a capital city and was sort of the center of all the major activities, that didn't really happen until fairly late and Shah Jahanabad under Shah Jahan. But even then, it was not. Aurangzeb moved to the Deccan, so really there wasn't a consistent capital city.
And also the layout of the camp in which the Mughal emperors resided. So it was built like a city, and there's this argument that this legacy of the Central Asian empires to have this moving capital of sorts or moving court was at the time of Akbar was already there. So he had built Fatehpur Sikri, but he did not occupy this as a permanent capital. He also continued to move from one location to another.
Right. Shrikant, you had a question?
Yeah. Do we know what prompted the rise of Agra as a preeminent city? I mean, I know Agra was the capital for much of the 16th century, right? Until the times of Shah Jahan when it moved back to Delhi. So I'm just wondering, because I don't think Agra as a city was all that eminent during the Sultanate.
Right. It wasn't a very major city. I remember reading there was a book called Akbar Ka Darbar written in Urdu, in which there was some discussion of how they choose Agra as the capital. And it was like this so-and-so general landed there and saw that the spot was good and sort of made a decision to make a fort on one side of it or whatever. So there is some story to it. Somebody chose it as a good place to work from. I don't know if they had battles going on around that area, that they were interested more in that area than Delhi at that point. But I'm not sure why they picked Agra. If Jay knows something about it.
In the case of Agra, so Sikandar Lodi was the one who established the Agra fort. And during the time of Akbar, it was enlarged. So this fort was enlarged, and the modern fort which we see is mostly of Akbar's creation. And I think the reason for Agra was the fact that it was strategically located. So I think if we look at the empire, particularly an empire which has control over most of northern India and also parts of Central Asia. So if we look at during the ancient period, so we have the Kushanas. So one of the capitals of the Kushans was Mathura. So Mathura, if you look at the the location of Mathura, it can provide access to the plains of Gangetic Plains, and also it can easily provide you access to Central Asia, because otherwise if you have Lahore, so Lahore is close to Central Asia, but when it comes to the Gangetic Plains, you have to cross these rivers and then you descend into the Gangetic Plains. So in that sense, I think the location of Mathura or Agra, or even Delhi, so this is and also I think so this strategic location of these three cities in my view is a factor in this capital location.
Right. Moving on, and Omar Sahab, I'll start with you on this. If I say Aurangzeb's sown the seeds of Hindu Rashtra, will I be mistaken?
Maybe not. I mean, he sowed the seeds of the decline of the Mughal Empire. I think he did, but this is something historians debate all the time, right? Who led why did the empire decline after his rule, or by the end of his rule? I think that the fact that he fought a 20-year, 30-year war in the Deccan with the Marathas, which he could not win, and in which he wasted like billions of rupees, is enough reason in itself probably to put the empire into crisis. Then he ruled for such a long time. His sons and grandsons were all grown up by the time, so they all fought each other once he did die, and the empire sort of never recovered from that succession struggle also. And then he also imposed, or he was more of a Orthodox Muslim than his predecessors, and he made more of a systematic effort to make this a Muslim empire, not some kind of polyglot empire ruled by a ruler who happens to be Muslim, right? So there was a systematic, he reintroduced jizya, he stopped patronizing the arts that he considered un-Islamic, right? Included like painting and music were big in the early Mughal emperors, and all the miniature painting and everything. But during the reign of Aurangzeb, miniatures of the Mughal rulers are not made anymore after a certain point. Mostly the artists shifted to Rajput courts and hill Rajas and other places. They became the center of the miniature painting and everything. So there was decline or change in many things in his rule. But other people have also argued that it's also just a matter of how the empire was run. Right, Akbar's system, while it was quite innovative and effective, did have its weaknesses. This whole business of having Fajdars who are given, landed estates, which are then rotated and which are not necessarily going to go to their sons. It doesn't create a kind of a stable aristocracy that you have in Europe, for example. These are not the same kind of feudal system then. And the local, the succession struggle at each emperor's death, that they never changed. So there was always a succession struggle. They all killed their brothers, nephews, uncles, sons, whatever. And then the tax collectors becoming corrupt over time, the empire itself becoming so extractive that it started to crush the peasants. I think this was Irfan Habib's thesis, right? That the peasantry had been sort of overexploited, and by the end of Aurangzeb's reign, they had started revolting everywhere. And like the Sikh revolt, the Maratha revolt, all these revolts then become an expression of the peasantry just being too unhappy. And there may be some truth to it, right? The peasantry, the Mughal Empire was famously efficient at extraction and probably extracted a bigger part of the surplus than any of their predecessors had managed to do. They took roughly half of your produce, right? And they really took it. I mean, you couldn't hide too much of it. But all these systems are prone to corruption, and by the time of Aurangzeb, those corruptions had crept in. There is some, I remember reading somewhere that the Mughal Empire was in surplus in the time of Jahangir and in the time of Shah Jahan. But by the end of Shah Jahan's reign, already all these thousands and thousands of aristocrats and people who are living off the blood and sweat of the peasantry have become excessive, and the expenditure is already starting to exceed their income. By the time of Aurangzeb and his extremely ruinous wars with the Marathas, they were completely in debt, and he left behind kind of a drained treasury and a very unstable empire that rapidly fractured when he died. So I think, yeah, Aurangzeb is probably the man responsible for that. But is he the source of Hindu Rashtra? I mean, I don't know. Partition is maybe the source of Hindu Rashtra more than he was. After all, even Swami Vivekananda is writing that what India needs is kind of, I remember this sentence, it's something like, what India needs is a Vedanta brain and an Islamic body, right? An average Indian could not conceive of the Muslims as not being a factor in India. And people now wonder, why they went after, why was Gandhi supporting the Khilafat movement? Well, whatever, whether it was a miscalculation or not, the fact is that it was not uncommon for an ordinary Indian politician or person to think that we Muslims are a part of this India, and a big part of this India, right? Even a dominant part of this India. And that anything you have to, when you imagine India, you have to imagine them as well. It is only after partition that it became possible to imagine a Hindu India that doesn't have to treat the Muslims as sort of equal partners or near partners in the enterprise. So the Aurangzeb creating Hindu Rashtra, maybe not. Maybe it was a much longer process. But there was definitely a collapse of Mughal authority after Aurangzeb, right? And the non-Muslim empires that rose to take its place mostly replaced Muslim rule all over India. Marathas and Sikh Empire in the northwest later. So but the empire was going to fall apart at some point anyway. So who knows when and how it would have happened is probably variable, but maybe it was meant to end in any case. Let's see what Jay has to say.
And Shrikant, before Jay starts, you have a question?
Yeah, basically I wanted to add to what Omar Saab said. On the extractive nature of the late Mughal Empire, right? I mean, during Aurangzeb's time, here's a statistic. I think around 1700, the Mughal Empire collected about twice as much land revenue as the British Raj did 200 years later in 1880. Right? Though the economy size was roughly the same in both periods, right? It's not as though the economy had grown considerably, but the land revenue during the Mughal period was 2 times what was collected in 1880 by the British Raj, right? And this is something that is asserted in William Wilson Hunter's Indian Gazetteer, I think, which was later condensed into a book called The Indian Empire, which is basically a history of the British Raj in India. So there he compares his own administration favorably with that of Aurangzeb, saying that we are far less extractive than the Mughals were. Right, and this is also, I think, backed by a post-independence economist or historian rather, Shireen Musvi, who worked with Irfan Habib. I think they undertook a detailed study of Akbar I some time back, a few decades ago, and their conclusion was that the state appropriated about 57% of the total produce in North India during Akbar's time. Right, that just goes to show that it was a very extractive state.
Right.
Yeah.
And we haven't discussed the sort of the economy and the technology of the Mughals, but just to say briefly, it was a large empire and it was a very big economy. And the fact of having an empire, that is always conducive. Once it becomes stable, it is conducive to economic growth, right? It doesn't matter what the ideology or whatever of the empire and who is ruling. The fact of having an empire where people have peace and they can travel from one place to another hundreds of miles away and do trade, that automatically means there's going to be economic growth. And there was economic growth in the Mughal period. And India was the world's largest producer of textiles and was a major exporter of textiles. And at the time of Aurangzeb or Shah Jahan, I think, was a bigger economy than Qing China, which was its nearest competitor, really. No one else came even close. So this was a huge empire with a huge economy. And there were innovations and improvements made along the way also. But at the same time, the sort of great achievements that people talk about are very elite achievements, like the poetry and the painting and the architecture, the expensive monuments that they built to themselves. they're not really that much interested. They didn't set up colleges and universities. They did not promote kind of the welfare of the common people beyond a sort of a general statement that they are providing justice to the people, right? They did see themselves as in that role, even for all the people. That meant even their Hindu subjects. But again, the people providing justice were qazis. They were Muslim judges, and even Hindus would be judged by these people. So it's a mixed bag, and but still a huge empire with a large economy at that point.
Jay, I would like to hear from you about a term called jazia. What's the background, and why is it so synonymous typically with usually with Aurangzeb's rule?
Jizya, I think jizya existed before the Mughals. The Delhi Sultanate had jizya. And as I have said that in 1564, Akbar famously does away with jizya. So jizya was a religious tax.
It's a
religious tax.
Religious tax. So it's a tax levied exclusively on the non-Muslim subjects of the empire.
Yes.
And it's a poll tax, meaning that you pay it by the person, right? If there are 5 people in the house, you pay a certain amount x5.
Right. And Jay, why is it synonymous, especially with Aurangzeb?
Because Aurangzeb was the one, after Akbar in 1564 does away with jizya. So there was no jizya, and Aurangzeb famously, re-establishes this tax. So that is why Aurangzeb is associated with jizya.
Right. Omar sir brought up a point that Mughals were not really keen on building large universities or colleges, which brings me to the point, what was it about this empire that while there was a renaissance, a post-renaissance revival going on in Europe, where are the Oxfords and the Cambridges of the Indian subcontinent? What advancements did the Mughals make, or why did they not make any substantial advancements in healthcare or mathematics or sciences?
I think this is a question that actually is part of a more general question, right? It's not just the Mughals, the Safavids, the Ottomans, the Qing Empire in China, all these huge, powerful, non-European empires that used to be a threat actually to everyone around them. They got left behind by Europe at this point. So part of it is not specific to the Mughals. It's more like what happened in Europe that made them so good at such some things, which did not happen in India, China. And people argue maybe we were sort of in the proto-industrial stage already. So Qing China or Mughal India would eventually have had the same kind of industrial revolution. But maybe not. We don't know for sure. But this is an argument that goes on endlessly, and where people have very strong and very varied opinions about why that was so. But the end result is there. The Mughals, for all their success at creating an empire and building a huge army, were not very innovative after they had settled down. And they, like when they had conquered India, part of it was because they had a technological edge, right? Babar had better artillery than any of his opponents. But by the time of Aurangzeb, there is no special technological edge to the Mughals. All their opponents have the same kind of weapons. They all have the same kind of organization. And the Europeans are clearly one generation ahead of them or more. And this was like even applied to things like shipbuilding. India was actually, I learned this recently, was a major center of shipbuilding, right? Even in those times. Bengal and Gujarat both had major shipbuilding industries, and they copied European ships without any problem. They started building ships for the Portuguese. But what they could not build was the whole organization or system or the warships that the Europeans had, and the advanced sails and the techniques and the navigation techniques. All of those remained like primitive compared to the Europeans. By the 1600s, the Europeans were going everywhere with mechanical clocks, right? And this was one of their gifts that they gave to Jahangir. They gave a mechanical clock to the Qing emperor. Most people found them fascinating because they were technologically very advanced things. But the Mughals showed no interest in actually making clocks of their own, for example. They never made a watchmaking industry. Maybe it's unfair because the watchmaking is actually high-tech stuff for that time, right? The small, fine gears and the fine springs and things. Those are not technologies that can be made by a primitive mistri. You need more sophisticated sort of industrial metallurgy to make a watch. And the Mughals didn't get there, but they clearly were falling behind and were not growing or sort of learning science and technology at the same rate as the Europeans. Why this happened is the same thing happened to the Qing emperors in China. It happened to the Iranian Empire. It happened to the Ottoman Empire. So it's a more general question, and I don't think we can settle it in this podcast because it's not been settled in the wider world either, right? People just don't know, or people have many different theories and they fight with each other.
Right. Jay, how did the Mughals by the end of Aurangzeb, or even during the time of Aurangzeb, see themselves? Were they now looking at themselves as Indians, or were they still looking at themselves as descendants of Timur and people who were here to rule and conquer this place?
I think this view that they were Timurids was always present, and the fact that they considered themselves Indian, I think that was not the case, because although they considered this land to that this was their right to rule this land. So this, I think, is a separate point. So, and this should not be confused with the fact that they considered themselves Indian. They considered that this it was their right to rule this land because Timur had conquered that, and after them, from Babar, you have a continuous line of Mughals who are ruling this land. So in that way, it was clear in their mind that this land belonged to them. But they, in my view, they did not consider themselves as Indian. I think Omar Saab will have to say something about it.
I agree. I don't think they considered themselves Indian in the sense that they would take pride in being Indian and or in Indian history prior to Muslim rule, right? That was never part of their self-conception. I may say that my ancestors wrote the Mahabharata, but no Mughal would say that. It would not be part of their sort of self-image at all. Their ancestors were Mongols or Genghis Khan or Timur or Turks. Their ancestors were not Indians and Hindus. And they regarded these people as an inferior people. Clearly, there was a very clear racial element also. They thought of themselves as a superior race. And in that, they were not unusual. Everybody thought of themselves as a superior race in those days. But they did. And they ruled over India. They owned this land in the sense that they had, by the time of Shah Jahan, is the last attempt to actually go and conquer Samarkand, and that failed, right? They lost a lot of money and people trying to do that, and they failed. So they gave up after that. Aurangzeb, for all his war fighting here, and they had never made any attempt to conquer Central Asia again, as far as I remember. So so they had settled in and become Hindustani in that sense. They were rulers of Hindustan, but they saw themselves as a foreign family who, as a superior people who had conquered this land and made it their own by right of conquest.
Right. Any closing comments, Gaurav, Shrikant, Jay, Omar Saab?
I think we'll have to do one more on the post-Mughal and the fall of the Mughal Empire and whatever. And of course, there are aspects we didn't touch. The women, the Zanana, the way things were run. But it's too much to do in one podcast. So thank you all. And let's have some last words from Jay.
Yeah, we'll do a follow-up episode on India in the 18th century. That's when we'll cover the post-Aurangzeb Mughal Empire. And yes, we missed out on some aspects, but then there's so much to cover. Jay, any thoughts, any comments, anything that you would like to sort of mention that we sort of missed out discussing?
No, I think we can, in the next podcast, we can talk about the technological, particularly the military aspect of the Mughal Empire. So that would be a great topic, I think.
We should do one more on the Mughal Empire, focusing this time more on institutions, technologies, collection, things like that.
Yeah.
Shrikant, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I guess, as Omarji said, the cultural history of this period, maybe it can be dealt with in a separate episode, right? So things that we didn't touch upon.
Sure. Gaurav?
Yeah, no. That's it. So we have a lot to cover. So maybe
Now, what we'll do is we'll do a follow-up episode on this, and in that episode we'll also cover the Mughal Empire post Aurangzeb, and that's when we can cover the softer aspects, the culture, the literature, the arts, and what made Mughals what they finally ended up as, the softer aspects.
yeah,
Right.
sure.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.